My child's father left us to live freely, but when he realized independence wasn't what he imagined, he wanted to come back. I said no. Now I'm the villain. My partner left me and our baby to find himself, and told me he was never coming back. He took all our savings with him. Weeks later, he returned, claiming he wanted to be a family again. I feel conflicted about the decision I made for my family and want to know if I was right or wrong in this situation. For weeks ago, my fiancé, Jake, dropped a bombshell. One evening, he announced he was leaving me and our son, Liam. The news hit me like a freight train. It came out of nowhere, and I was completely blindsided. Jake was the love of my life. I'd fallen for him hard and fast when we met at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner. We became friends first, and then it evolved into dating when we realized our feelings were mutual. Getting into a relationship with Jake felt effortless, but there was an issue right from the start: the lack of intimacy. Jake had always been indifferent about physical affection and rarely initiated romantic moments. I had less experience in relationships than he did, so his aloofness made me question whether he found me attractive at all. Whenever I tried to discuss it, Jake reassured me that he did, but he'd often follow up with excuses, like being exhausted from work. What hurt me even more was noticing him checking out other women when we were out together. Clearly, it wasn't that he wasn't attracted to women in general. Our physical connection was sporadic, maybe once every 6 or 7 weeks. Over time, our relationship began to feel more like a deep friendship with a few scattered moments of romance. I wanted more, but I stayed silent because I loved him. I also didn't want to risk making him uncomfortable by constantly bringing it up. I convinced myself that, given his experience, he would take the lead if he wanted more. Eventually, I resigned myself to the way things were. It's worth noting that Jake struggled with depression after losing his father when he was in college. He had been on medication for years, and I suspected that might be contributing to his low libido. While our physical connection was lacking, Jake depended on me emotionally. He was naturally introverted and rarely shared personal details with anyone, even his closest friends. That changed after we got together. He began opening up about his childhood, his father's death, and his family life. When I met his mother, Linda, for the first time, she immediately noticed the change in him. Later, she pulled me aside to say that it had been years since she'd seen Jake so happy. We dated for almost 5 years before he proposed, though our journey wasn't without its challenges. One incident that stands out is when I discovered he had been texting other women. Early in our relationship, I found out he'd been chatting with his ex-girlfriend, Emily. Emily had cheated on Jake with one of his friends, Aaron, and although she begged for forgiveness, Jake ended the relationship. Even after their breakup, Emily continued trying to rekindle things with him. I remember how she would text him constantly during the first few months Jake and I were dating. He used to tell me it was her turn to suffer, and swore he'd never take her back after what she did. That's why I was completely stunned when I found messages between Jake and Emily. Not only had he been talking to her behind my back, but he'd also been complaining about me, about my career, my weight, my looks, and even my cooking. Emily initiated most of the conversations, often bragging about how much better she was than me. Instead of defending me or cutting her off, Jake seemed to agree with her. He had written long paragraphs about how I wasn't his type and how he preferred women like Emily. However, since Emily had cheated on him, he decided to settle for someone like me. Emily made cruel comments about my belly, my back, and my figure, even calling me names like a penguin. Reading their chats left me utterly shocked and disgusted. To clarify, I am not and have never been overweight. I go for yearly checkups and work out when I can. Sure, I wasn't as toned as Emily, who played volleyball in college, but that didn't justify the awful way they spoke about me. Their conversation wasn't flirty, but all they did was criticize me and mock my appearance. There was even a photo of me in a dress I had worn to a close friend's wedding. Jake had sent it to Emily, saying, "You'd look so much better in this dress." Emily gleefully agreed. I was at a complete loss for words. That night, I broke down and cried until I couldn't anymore. When Jake came home, I confronted him about the chats. His face went pale, and he looked like he had been caught red-handed. He immediately dropped to his knees, apologizing profusely and admitting how wrong he had been. Through tears, I told him that if he wasn't attracted to me, he should have just talked to me, and we could have ended things without all this cruelty. But Jake started pleading, saying how much he loved me and couldn't survive without me. He admitted that I wasn't his ideal type physically but insisted I was still the person he wanted to be with. I was ready to walk out that night, but his tears and desperate pleading made me stay. I hated how much I loved him because, despite all the glaring red flags, I hoped he would eventually change and learn to appreciate me for who I was. After that confrontation, I asked Jake to block Emily, and he agreed, promising never to contact her again. There were other incidents, like the time I found him chatting with random women on dating apps during the second year of our relationship. He quickly apologized and deleted the apps, but those moments still lingered in my memory. By the time Jake proposed to me, he seemed to have turned over a new leaf. We were the happiest we'd ever been, so I didn't think twice before saying yes. After we got married, things seemed to improve. Our relationship felt more fulfilling. We were more consistently intimate, and Jake would tell me every day how much he loved me. We spent lazy weekends cuddling, watching movies, and just enjoying each other's company. Eventually, I got pregnant with our son, Liam. At first, Jake wasn't thrilled about the pregnancy. He was worried about our finances and whether we could afford raising a baby. I reassured him that I would go back to work after maternity leave so we could maintain our lifestyle. Both my parents and Linda, Jake's mom, stepped in to help after Liam was born, and they've been a tremendous support, especially with babysitting. Jake, however, wasn't always a present father. He rarely helped out with Liam, but I didn't pressure him. I hoped he'd grow into the role eventually. One redeeming quality Jake had was that he helped with household chores, even after tiring days at work, something I knew wasn't common based on my friends' experiences. That's why I never imagined the day would come when Jake would leave me and Liam. In the weeks leading up to his announcement, he had been acting distant and distracted. I brushed it off as stress from work, never suspecting what was really going on. I brushed off Jake's odd behavior as work-related stress. We'd been together for so long, standing by each other through thick and thin, that I thought he'd eventually bounce back. But 4 weeks ago, Jake confessed that he couldn't live with us anymore and wanted to go somewhere far away to find himself. At first, I thought he was joking. No rational partner would say such a thing to their family, especially with a newborn baby. But Jake was serious. He said that living with us made him question the meaning and purpose of his life, and that he was done pretending to be happy. Every word he spoke felt like a dagger, and a storm of anger and despair swirled inside me. He reassured me that he still loved us, but couldn't ignore how he felt anymore. If he stayed, he said, his frustration would only grow worse. Trying to make sense of it, I asked him directly if he'd been taking his medications, thinking his depression might be the cause. My question infuriated him. I suggested counseling, but Jake exploded, shouting that Liam and I were the reasons for his depression. He claimed that living with us made him hate his life. I froze, unable to process the disgust and hatred in his voice. Then, out of nowhere, he accused me of baby-trapping him. The accusation was ridiculous. Jake hadn't contributed a single cent toward Liam's care. I earned significantly more than him and covered about 80% of our bills, including all of Liam's expenses. How could I trap someone who brought nothing to the table financially? When I pointed this out, Jake bitterly replied that he'd hoped having a son would fix his life, but he'd realized he didn't want this life anymore. I was overwhelmed, struggling to make sense of his words. It felt like the walls of our home were closing in around me. My voice shook as I asked him if he planned to leave me to raise our son alone. Jake nodded slowly and said, "You're his mother, so Liam should be your responsibility." I sat there in stunned silence as he continued, explaining how I wouldn't understand, but he needed to do this for himself. He said he'd given it a lot of thought and decided to start a new life far away where he could be himself. My world came crashing down. I couldn't believe the man I had loved and trusted for so many years was abandoning me and our baby. My first instinct was to scream, plead, do anything to make him stay. But as I looked at his face, I knew he had already made his decision. There was no turning back. That night, Jake didn't even sleep in our bed. He went downstairs and slept on the couch. It was the first time we'd ever slept apart, and it confirmed how serious he was about leaving. Jake moved out the following week, leaving me to explain to everyone that he had walked out on us. When I told my family, they were just as shocked as I was. No one could understand why my fiancé, my partner of so many years, would do such a thing. My parents were furious and immediately urged me to take legal action. But I was too numb and heartbroken to think about that. I needed time to process everything. Jake's mother, Linda, was devastated when I broke the news. She called him repeatedly, begging him to come back, but Jake told her the same story. He needed to find himself. Everyone assumed this was tied to his depression and worried deeply about his mental health. But the way Jake had been acting made it clear he had thought this through. 2 days after he left, I discovered he had emptied our entire savings account. I realized it while grocery shopping when my card was declined at the register. Confused and embarrassed, I checked our balance and saw that the account had been wiped clean. At first, I thought our account had been hacked, but I soon found out it was Jake who had taken all the money. This was a joint account that included my earnings. Jake had drained it completely without a word. I was furious and devastated. With no other choice, I called my parents for help. Thankfully, my dad came to my rescue. He drove me home while I sat in the passenger seat, panicking about how I'd pay rent and other bills that month. That evening, my dad had a serious talk with me. He told me it was time to face reality and move on from Jake. He pointed out how my fiancée had not only abandoned me and Liam, but also knowingly drained our savings, leaving us with nothing. As I looked into Liam's beautiful blue eyes, the fog started to lift. I realized just how much Jake had truly betrayed us. Without my dad's help, my baby wouldn't even have diapers or food. For the first time, it truly hit me. I had someone else to think about now, and my dad was right. Liam deserved better. That night, I made up my mind. The very next day, I would visit a lawyer with my dad and start the process to formally separate from Jake. My parents, who I will always be grateful for, offered to let me and Liam move into their basement. They wanted me to have privacy while I focused on taking care of Liam and rebuilding my life. At 31, I found myself with no money and a child to care for, all because I had trusted and chosen someone like Jake. I wanted to completely break down, but for Liam's sake, I held it together. I had never felt so low, like I had truly hit rock bottom. I took a few days off work to move in with my parents and get settled. Over time, my family and friends rallied around me, providing emotional support and a shoulder to lean on. My parents babysat Liam whenever they could, and even Jake's mother, Linda, came by to visit occasionally. Once my lawyer had drafted the paperwork for separation, I tried to contact Jake to send it to him. That's when I discovered he had changed his phone number. I had no way to reach him. With no other option, I decided to speak to Linda to see if she knew where her son was. When I told her about my decision, Linda broke down in tears. She said she never thought it would come to this and begged me to reconsider. But my parents stood firmly by my side. I reassured Linda that, no matter what happened between me and Jake, she would always have a place in Liam's life. I asked her to pass the message to Jake about the separation and let him know that the papers, including the custody agreement, were ready to sign. Though she was still crying, Linda reluctantly agreed to deliver the message. Last week, I got a call from an unknown number while I was at work. I ignored it at first, but later that evening, the same number called again. This time, I answered. To my surprise, it was Jake on the other end of the line. His voice was hesitant, and I was utterly speechless to hear from him after 4 weeks of silence. After an awkward pause, Jake told me that Linda had informed him about my decision to separate from him and that he urgently needed to talk to me. I firmly told him that anything he wanted to say could go through my lawyer. But Jake pleaded, insisting he needed to speak with me in person. Confused, I asked him to clarify, but he dodged my questions. He kept repeating that it was important and that we had to talk. His persistence was difficult to ignore. After a moment of hesitation, I reluctantly agreed to meet him. We decided to meet at a cafe near my parents' house. As I hung up the call, my mind raced with questions and uncertainty. I felt a wave of anxiety about the meeting, but chose not to tell my parents just yet. I knew my dad would likely lose his temper if he found out. On the day of our meeting, I arrived early and nervously sipped my coffee while waiting. Before long, Jake walked in, looking both hesitant and determined. It was surreal to see him again. In just 4 weeks, this man had gone from being someone I deeply loved to someone I could hardly look at without feeling disgust. Jake sat down and awkwardly asked how I was doing and if Liam was okay. I stayed quiet, keeping my emotional distance. Eventually, he got to the point. Jake told me Linda had informed him about my decision to divorce him, and he was completely shocked. He said hearing the word divorce made him realize how much he had messed up and that he didn't want to lose me or Liam. I stared at him blankly as he rambled on, spewing the kind of empty words I might have believed a few weeks ago. But now, I saw through them. Then, Jake dropped the bombshell. He wanted to come back. He begged me to forgive him, claiming it wasn't too late to fix things. He said we could go back to our normal lives and be a family again. I stared at him in disbelief as he explained that he'd realized this was the life he truly wanted and couldn't imagine living without us. I took a deep breath, collecting my thoughts. As much as I wanted Liam to have his father in his life, I knew we could never go back to the way things were. If Jake had truly cared about us, he wouldn't have emptied our savings account and left me and Liam to fend for ourselves. His actions were unforgivable, and no amount of pleading could erase the pain and anger he had caused. As tempting as the idea of being a family again sounded, I couldn't ignore the harsh reality of what he had done. I looked him in the eye and told him firmly that, while I appreciated his offer, I couldn't forgive or forget how selfishly he had abandoned me and our son. I told Jake that I was living at my parents' house and that they had been more of a parental figure to Liam than he ever was. I reminded him of how he'd accused me of baby-trapping him and told him he couldn't just waltz back into our lives. There was no guarantee he wouldn't pull the same stunt again in the future. I made it clear that my priority was protecting Liam and giving him a stable family to rely on. I brought up how selfish it was for him to drain our joint account and leave me alone to care for an infant. Jake tried to justify his actions, saying he knew my parents would step in and that he needed time to clear his head. I scoffed at his audacity and told him there was no chance I would ever take him back. Jake kept pleading, his eyes filled with desperation, but I stood my ground. Letting him back into our lives would be too risky, and I wasn't willing to take that gamble. My heart ached slightly as I rejected his offer, but I couldn't ignore the emotional scars he'd left behind. I walked out of the cafe, convinced this would be the last time I'd ever have to deal with him. Unfortunately, since that meeting, Linda has been trying to convince me to reconsider my decision. She keeps telling me to think about Liam, insisting he would want both parents in his life. She argues that Jake made a mistake and, as his partner, I should forgive him. Linda seems to think I'm being selfish and that I should prioritize Liam's comfort over my own heartbreak. But despite her words, I remain adamant about not giving Jake another chance. Her constant pressure has made me question my own judgment at times. I feel torn between the potential benefits of letting Jake back into Liam's life and the painful memories of his abandonment. So, Reddit, am I the asshole for rejecting Jake's offer and possibly keeping Liam from having a whole family? Should I forgive him and take him back? Update 1. In just a few days, I've received an overwhelming number of comments and messages. I'm relieved that the majority of you don't think I'm the asshole. I decided to take everyone's advice and talk to my parents about this first. They were shocked to hear that Jake had reached out to me, and my mom was furious that I went to meet him alone. My dad pointed out how Jake's constant flip-flopping and erratic behavior could be a sign of a mental health issue, as many of you also suggested. He firmly advised me never to meet Jake alone again. I agreed and confirmed my decision to not let Jake back into our lives. My parents were visibly relieved and told me I was making the right choice. They encouraged me to focus on finalizing the separation and moving forward. Some people have commented that I should forgive Jake, but this isn't about me anymore. Liam deserves a stable, loving parent, and Jake has shown that he's not capable of providing that. He doesn't deserve a second chance. There's also been speculation that Jake may have left me for another woman, and this wasn't entirely about his mental health. Honestly, I don't care what the reason was. He abandoned us, and I've been left to pick up the pieces regardless of his excuses. Update 2. The separation papers have been served to Jake, who is apparently living with his mom now. Since then, his calls have grown increasingly desperate. No matter how many times I've explained that I don't want him back, he keeps trying to contact me. As someone who avoids confrontation, I felt emotionally drained and cornered by his relentless attempts. Meanwhile, Linda has been sending messages, urging me to forgive Jake and reminding me about the sacrifices involved in being a good mother. Finally, my dad decided to step in. He went to Jake's place to confront him. My dad, a tough ex-military man, told Jake in no uncertain terms that he was lucky there were laws protecting him because, otherwise, my dad would have buried him alive for abandoning me and his grandson. I can only imagine how terrified Jake must have been during that conversation. My dad warned him to stop contacting me and to communicate only through his lawyer. Linda, still defending Jake, tried to convince my dad that forgiveness would be the best thing for everyone. But my dad stood his ground, and so do I. This is about Liam and giving him the stable, loving environment he deserves, something Jake has proven incapable of providing. Jake even snapped back at Linda, saying she should have raised a better son who wouldn't walk out on his family in the first place. Linda argued that Jake was struggling with mental health issues, but my dad reminded her that Jake had blamed me and Liam for his actions. He pointed out that the blame lies squarely on Jake, not me, and that she should stop pressuring me to forgive him. After that confrontation, Linda's texts stopped. Despite everything, I'm trying my best to stay focused on my work. I don't want to jeopardize my job, especially since I'm saving up to eventually move out on my own. My parents have been incredibly supportive, and I'm grateful for them every single day. I honestly don't know what I would have done without their love and help. For now, I've blocked Jake to prevent him from disturbing me further, and I plan to only see him during the formal proceedings. Update 3. It's been 2 months since my last update, and I finally have some news to share. Our separation proceedings are ongoing, but Jake has been fighting tooth and nail to make the process as difficult as possible. It's clear he just wants to drag it out. Since we don't own any property and I'm not asking for alimony, there's nothing substantial to dispute. Yet, his lawyer has been demanding equal co-parenting rights for Liam. The idea of him having equal custody is absolutely ridiculous. I don't want my son anywhere near someone as unstable as Jake. To protect Liam, my lawyer presented evidence in court about Jake's history of mental health struggles, his abrupt abandonment, and the fact that he drained our joint account while accusing me of baby-trapping him, despite me earning significantly more than he ever did. I'm hopeful the court will recognize how unreliable he is and deny him custody. There's no guarantee he'd act responsibly or safely if Liam were left alone with him. Linda has attended every court session, and she stares at me with obvious disdain. I neither acknowledge her nor care how she feels anymore. Initially, I considered letting her have a relationship with Liam, but after she blamed me and tried to pressure me into forgiving Jake, I decided against it. My priority is doing what's best for my child. After each court session, Linda has tried to approach me, but my dad always steps in to whisk me away before she can say anything. I know it will take time to finalize the separation, but in the meantime, I've decided to take a much-needed break. I'm planning a trip to Napa Valley with my parents and Liam. It's a place my parents have always wanted to visit, and I think we all deserve to create some joyful memories in the midst of this chaos. Update 4. It's been 5 months since my last update, and I finally have some happy and exciting news to share. First, I was recently promoted at work. This is a huge milestone for me. It not only comes with better pay, but also the satisfaction of knowing that my hard work and dedication have paid off. With this increase in income, I can now comfortably move out and live independently with Liam. Although my parents don't want me to go, as they've grown incredibly close to Liam, they understand that this is a necessary step for me to regain my independence. Their support has meant the world to me, and they've encouraged me every step of the way. Second, I'm officially separated. Thanks to my amazing lawyer, I am finally free from Jake and Linda. Despite their attempts to make my life a nightmare, the judge ruled in my favor. Jake was deemed unfit as a parent. He has been ordered to pay monthly child support and attend mandatory therapy sessions. If he completes therapy successfully and shows significant improvement, he may have the opportunity to revisit his parenting rights in the future. I doubt Jake will follow through with all of it, but if he ever does, I'll be ready to fight him again. Now that I'm financially stable, I've decided to invest in myself by starting therapy. I've come to realize I might have unresolved abandonment issues, and these sessions will help me process my emotions and become the best possible parent for Liam. After thorough research, I found an experienced and compassionate therapist who specializes in family dynamics and emotional healing. Despite the challenges and emotional turmoil my family and I have endured, I know we're going to be okay. This chapter of my life may have been painful, but I'm determined to write a new story, one filled with love, trust, and growth. Liam and I deserve nothing less.